So if we can have your attention, we got our last keynote speaker here. We saved the best for the last. This morning, as I sat down, Kirby brought this gentleman over, and we got talking. We ate breakfast together, and I'm sitting there and I'm going, man, this guy's really smart. And then I thought, well, he's smarter than me, and I know most of you are thinking, well, that doesn't mean anything. But this gentleman here, in just 5 minutes, he imparted some wisdom to me that was spectacular. Jeremy Carl, Stanford University. You can read the bio. We're not going to waste time with that. But let me just say, this guy knows what he's talking about. So give a good hand for Jeremy Carl.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. You always want to make sure you don't trip going to the stage after an introduction like that, which has happened to me before. And thank you so much, Commissioner. And I should warn you, I don't have a PowerPoint, so you're actually going to have to look at me or at least your lunch for the next 45 minutes, or your smartphone if you prefer. I'd like to thank Garfield County and Colorado Mesa University's Unconventional Energy Center for having me here today. I've been told I'm an unconventional guy myself, so maybe there's a good match for me here at this forum. In particular, I'd like to thank Kirby Wynn of Garfield County for reaching out and being kind enough to extend an invitation. It's always nice to get away from my fellow academics for a little while and engage with people who actually have to do things. I was very sorry that my late arrival last night precluded my ability to do the steak fry in the gas patch. From what I understand, it was nearby a drilling rig, and I have to tell you, I mean, that sounds so all-American that I think the only thing that would have made it more American is if there had been a B-52 flying over and Lee Greenwood had singing "God Bless the USA." So sorry to miss that. Maybe, Kirby, you can work on that for next year. But seriously, it's a pleasure to be here in Colorado. I know it's one of the most beautiful parts of the country. I know Coloradans love it when Californians express their fondness for the state. Perhaps not so much when they express a desire to move here. I won't deny that I've looked over the years, but nobody's made me an offer that I can't refuse yet. Still open. And as I have to say, as a Californian, it's nice to be in a beautiful place without, at least by the low standards I have as a Californian, reprehensible politics. And I mean that in a way. I mean, even your Democratic governor is a petroleum geologist. Most of the Democrats in California have a considerably less friendly view of the oil and gas industry. And I sort of put that out front because I should say that while I'm going to do my best here to offer you an impartial and unbiased analysis, and I've worked with many prominent political figures on both sides of the ideological divide, Democrats and Republicans. In fact, I just came here yesterday. I was just meeting with Canada's Environment and Climate Minister and hopped on a plane directly after that to come here. But I'm not without rooting interests here. I'm a conservative Republican. I've worked with a lot of Republican elected officials over the years, and so I just want to put that bias out there coming in. Again, it's not my intention to give a partisan talk, but you may just want to have that filter because I never like it when people come up and they have an agenda and they don't really state that agenda up front. And on the other hand, I hope that perspective that I have does put me in a little bit better position than some might be to talk about what this administration is actually going to do, because I do know some people, and I expect as they continue to fill ranks, I'll know an increasing number of people who are going to be in charge of setting policy in this administration. And I'd also add, it's great. I learned a lot this morning because there's a lot of stuff that's really ground truth here. We're always floating in the clouds, and again, I mean, there's just a lot of really interesting data about what's really going on in the gas patch. This sort of energy environment education for local and state officials. I wish we did more of that in California. Most Californians are blissfully unaware that we're in fact a major oil producing state, in fact bigger than Colorado in that regard, the third biggest oil producing state behind only Texas and North Dakota. And we before the fracking revolution, we were actually ahead of North Dakota. And we managed to do that despite having a very unfriendly government toward oil and gas production and a regulatory environment that's frankly set on stopping production. If you were to talk to the average person in San Francisco or near where I live in Palo Alto, I bet they'd be almost unaware that there's oil and gas in California, or even, frankly, they'd be unaware that cars could drive on something other than Tesla batteries and rainbows and unicorns. So I think events like this one can be really critical in informing state and local officials about both the promises and the challenges of oil and gas development in their state. And I mean, I think it's a great resource that's been set up here. As I was preparing this speech, I had a flashback to a recent political event that I'd kind of keynoted in another state at some time back. And I was lecturing the audience, and they were sort of listening intently, or at least appearing to listen intently. And when you're the speaker, that's all you care about, is whether they appear to be listening intently, about how the political situation was and how it might affect their state. I looked in the audience, and there in this audience was the U.S. Senator from the state, and the state Senate Majority Leader, and the state House Majority Leader. And as I sort of looked over the audience, I thought, what in the world am I doing telling these guys about the politics of their own state? It's sort of like lecturing Eskimos about the different varieties of snow. And I hope to avoid lecturing Eskimos here today. I know you guys, it was very clear to me from these earlier presentations this morning, have probably forgotten more than I will ever know about the intricacies of oil and gas development in Colorado and the chances, the issues that you're dealing with there. But when it comes to technical details, again, your expertise certainly exceeds mine. While there are folks who do know a lot more about Colorado oil and gas, I know, in addition to a fair bit about energy, which is my professional field of study, I know an embarrassing amount about grubby national politics and how those grubby realities of politics are likely to interact with policy in the age of Trump. And as I said, that's a little bit of an embarrassing revelation on my part. My mom is proud whenever I come out with a new book or article on energy, but she isn't proud when I spend time on politics. It doesn't make the family Christmas letter, but there it is. And so I'm going to try to put the fruits of some of that ill-gotten knowledge to work for you in my talk this afternoon. And I'm really going to be trying to go sort of at a 30,000 foot level. We've really been talking about on the ground, but I want to give the broadest sort of overview of what's going on nationally, what's likely to go on in the next 4 years, and what is that maybe going to mean for Colorado. So let's recall some of the rhetoric from the current election, because I think that's a good place to start. I've titled this talk, "The Energy Game Just Changed, the Future of Energy Policy in the Trump Administration." And this election was truly a game changer. The difference between where I think we are on energy policy and where we thought we were going to be a year ago is about as stark as I can ever remember in my lifetime of watching politics and policy. And a year ago, I was just like every other smart person in America. I knew exactly what I'd be saying at a talk like this. I'd be talking about what President Clinton was going to be doing on environment and energy, and the Paris Climate Accord and the Clean Power Plan, and the ever-tightening regulations on hydraulic fracturing and methane emission rules and tightening sage-grouse rules, and how the industry and local government's going to react to all that. So, maybe I'm not as smart as I was trying to be led on there by the introduction. I think, frankly, a lot of experts, pretty much all the experts, were sort of surprised by what happened in November. And I think a lot of folks are still processing that. Let's just recall, let's go back to the election and think about some of the rhetoric that went on, because I think, again, when we talk about the delta between where we thought we were going to be and where we actually are, it's kind of instructive. On our campaign site, Hillary called climate change, Hillary Clinton called climate change an urgent threat and the defining challenge of our time. President Trump has at times dismissed it as a hoax. there's a lot of green grass between those two opinions, okay? Hillary Clinton looked to enforce tighter fuel economy standards for cars and trucks. The Trump administration may well loosen them. Hillary Clinton promised to, in quotes, cut the billions of wasteful tax subsidies for oil and gas companies have enjoyed for too long. Don't beat me up, I'm just quoting the website, that's what it said. And that same website said, we must ensure that areas too sensitive for energy production are taken off the table. By contrast, President Trump once remarked, I'm quoting again directly, this is actually from 2011, so before he was a candidate, to be fair. I think it's incredible that we're going slow on drilling. I think it's beyond anything I've ever seen that we're going slow on drilling. There are always going to be problems. You're going to have an oil spill. You clean it up and you fix it up and you'll be fine. If you look at natural gas, we're the Saudi Arabia times 100 of natural gas, but we don't use it. Okay, again, I'm not judging, I'm just saying those are two really, really different visions of where we go. And I think it's also instructive to say, look, we had a very divided electorate, right? So it's, some places even in this state may be more Democratic or more Republican, but as a whole, we've got a lot of people who are subscribing to one version or another of that vision. In contrast to sort of the Hillary Clinton's keep it in the ground philosophy, President Trump just signed an executive order demanding that all government departments report back on any regulations that are impeding direct domestic energy development, and that they do that within the next 180 days. That was something that was put out in late March. That, by the way, is kind of a process. We can kind of get into what these processes are. They sort of make your eyes glaze over after a time. But basically, he needs to do that so that he can tee up deregulating some more things. I mean, there has to be a way that he works with agencies to do that. So that's all a broad way of saying elections matter. They matter a lot. President Trump made increasing domestic energy production a centerpiece of his campaign. And since he's come in, he's ratcheted down the Democrats' kind of emphasis on renewables and efficiency. So let's talk for a second about what that might mean in a Colorado context. And this is the part where I'm probably treading on the most dangerous ground. So please do forgive any errors that I make, and you can correct me in the comments. So I realize as a business entity, Colorado Oil and Gas has been a little bit up and down in the last few years. We saw some of the production data in some of the talks earlier, which in net production has increased hugely, right? I mean, a factor of 4 in 4 or 5 years. But obviously prices, we're in a low price environment, and that's partially because a lot of other people are increasing their production at the same time. We've had a tripling of reserves, though, since 2010 in the Niobrara shale, and the federal government's reclassifying of the resource base in the Mancos shale, basically right out the front door here, as best I can tell from looking at the basin map. It now holds 66.3 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and that's more than 40 times more than was from the previous estimate. This was from the USGS estimate of June 2016. And again, not probably news to a lot of the folks in this room, but I wasn't aware that the resource had increased. Basically, I mean, you're now talking about that shale being second only to Marcellus in terms of the quantity of resource, which is kind of staggering. I mean, I think people tend to think down in Texas, would have been one of the shales there. So, I mean, there's a huge resource to access there if it can be done in a way that is, kind of balances all the other values that are important to people in this state. So that's going to attract a lot of attention ultimately, not just nationally, but globally. And yet I think it's a story that's not well known outside of Colorado. And I think this is where one of these areas where the Trump administration could really be a game changer. And let me give you an example of what I'm talking about, just relating to the shale reserves here in Colorado. And again, this will be familiar to some of you. Again, the BLM and the U.S. Forest Service released management plans for the White River National Forest right near here in December 15th and August 2016. And typically those sorts of management plans will govern for 15 or 20 years kind of how development and recreation and everything else is balanced within a national forest. Well, those don't take into account at all this new USGS assessment that was done. It's still pretending there's 3 trillion TCF as opposed to 66 trillion TCF of gas in the shale. And this is a classic governmental example of the right hand just not having any idea what the left hand is doing, right? I mean, now how you're coming up, you add USGS in July, putting out this new estimate, and then in August, there's a plan released that makes no reference to that estimate. So, you know, I get that sometimes these things are hard, but I think that's where also producers can kind of get frustrated, and understandably so. Right now, because right now drilling is pretty tightly restricted as best I can understand in that shale. The Trump administration could put this decision much more in the hand of local land managers and give flexibility based on this new information to reopen those plans. And interestingly, a gentleman named Nick Loris at the Heritage Foundation, a guy who I'd say has probably been as influential as anybody, this is a think tank in DC, on kind of the Trump administration's energy personnel and energy policies, has actually written very specifically about this shale and kind of how it should be opened up. And so I would anticipate that there are folks within the Department of Interior right now, and EPA and the Forest Service, who this is sort of on their radar, even though they're not talking about it yet. So I think that's a good ally to have in your corner if you're interested in development. Again, the White River Forest plan from USFS in December 2015 came out. Less than 10% of the area was eligible for exploration on this shale. That's less than half of what you had even in the previous plan in 1993. BLM, based on this kind of fake 2000, I mean, talk about fake news, fake 3 trillion TCF estimate, wanted to cancel 25 of the 65 existing leases. And given the new resource assessment, allow me to offer a technical and academic evaluation of that idea. That's crazy, okay? I mean, that is my academic evaluation of that. So the feds have the power to revisit this, and they should. And now, obviously, there are some areas in which you're not going to want to put drilling equipment, even under a multiple use scenario. And I think it's important to keep in mind. And again, I would imagine most of the people, given particularly most of the industry people here will know this, but national forests are not national parks. They are actually explicitly designed and were designed from moment one for multiple uses. Resource development, resource extraction, recreation, and kind of finding the appropriate balance of those uses given each individual forest or community. And there are some areas you're not going to do that in. I mean, we're not going to go be drilling in downtown Aspen or Breckenridge or the Vail Ski Resort, okay? It's just not going to happen, right? But there are Forest Service lands that were designed for these multiple uses, and we should be, I think, aggressive about where we can do so safely in an environmentally sound way, making sure that we're taking advantage of opportunities. So, you know, how do you develop some political consensus about this? This is an area where I've actually kind of maybe departed a little bit from orthodoxy. There was a discussion a little bit earlier from one of our presenters about how certain drilling activities fund various kind of environmental programs, at least at a basic level here. I think that is a incredibly positive dynamic, and that particularly going into new areas, you almost want to be more aggressive about creating a linkage between we explore a new resource and we set aside some amount of money so that all of a sudden, like, that national forest has more resources than they know what to do with. If you go into most national forests or anything that's not a national park, you often find, you know, really weak facilities, and this is not bashing people, it's just reality of the budget, right? There's never, you know, backcountry huts, there's not any of these things. If you tie the ability that, you know, I'm going to put a gas well here or an oil well here, and that's going to benefit some other part of the forest, that I'm going to be able to do something really exciting from a resource conservation or from a visitor and recreation opportunity, I think that just creates a really healthy dynamic. That's actually something I've discussed with a couple of senators on my side of the aisle and have gotten a very positive reception on, sort of something I hadn't considered for whatever reason. And so I would love to see more of that. I think kind of a notion, nobody likes to pay taxes or anything like that, but I think we can be penny wise and pound foolish about that. I think it is much better to create a positive dynamic between resource development and conservation, where they're working in a symbiotic and synergistic fashion rather than when they're kind of at loggerheads. So, that's a personal opinion, obviously, but I hope it's one that I know it's one I'll be talking to the administration about, and I'm hoping it's one that they will have a receptive ear. As White River shows, extraction policy is also going to be delivered, it's going to be a lot by economics and politics and not just geology. Okay, you've got a huge resource there right now. It's not the most developed resource. It's certainly not undeveloped, but it's not developed nearly as much as some places that are not as rich. We've seen a small revival in gas prices, obviously, over the last few months, but I think it's worth noting last March at Henry Hub, gas was down to 173 per million BTU. This March, they were back up to 288. In February 2014, it was $6. In June of 2008, before the fracking revolution really took off, it was $12.69. Okay, those dollars and cents, those financial realities are going to say a lot more about what happens in this industry more than any tweet that President Trump fires off about making tight oil and shale gas great again. I mean, that's just reality, okay? Money talks. You have a very different development environment when gas is sitting at $1.73 and when it's sitting at $12. Now, I don't think, and I think most of the people who spend their lives projecting these things don't think we're going to be in an environment of $12 gas or even anything approximating it for the near future. But I would certainly say whether we wind up in a $5 gas environment or a $2 gas environment, pricing-wise, is going to make a lot of difference in terms of a lot of these things. There's some obvious areas where this can have an immediate impact. Let's talk about FERC for a second, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They need to be involved with the approval of Jordan Cove. That's a project I know is near and dear to the hearts of some folks here. And I expect this administration will revisit this decision, which was originally rejected. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But let's discuss it a bit now, because I think parenthetically it's always interesting to me the way that we talk about pipelines and this notion of public benefit, and that you have to prove this public benefit before you can build a pipeline, especially involving eminent domain. And certainly I'm very sympathetic to, you don't want eminent domain abuse, but in general, the notion that if a private company is willing to put up billions of dollars to build something, it's because there's a public that they think is going to be willing to use that, and the public, through their purchase of that supply, will benefit from it. And so I think that often these decisions from regulators kind of go to an extreme, and it becomes a red herring where kind of public benefits are set at a place in which it becomes very hard to justify it. And originally I realized Jordan Cove didn't have buyers, and I think that was maybe a reasonable point for regulators to step in and say, hey, you need to do a little better. But then even when they did have buyers, and I don't know, again, all the details of this in the way that I'm sure some people in this room did, but they did not get a favorable response from regulators. And I think, offhand, that seems a little short-sighted. I also think Jordan Cove is an example of how much the world can change quickly, and I think everything that I'm saying today, I'd keep that in mind. The Jordan Cove project was originally an import pipeline and terminal, right? This is when we didn't have natural gas, allegedly. And obviously, when the gas environment changed, that project changed. And while the shale gas revolution, I think, is absolutely here to stay, prices can still be volatile. And so the reality is public benefits are out there, and we're going to need to show enough public benefits for any of these projects to get the general public comfortable. And again, I'm not suggesting that we should give that the short shrift in any way. I just think sometimes the standard is a little bit high. President Trump is also probably a little bit less careful about eminent domain than I would be. I mean, he's, as a developer, I think he's he's gotten crosswise, frankly, with a lot of people in his own party about his use of eminent domain. So I think he will be less cautious about this, at least by instinct. But I think there'll be others who, appropriately so, will be more cautious. So let's move from the key regional issue of Jordan Cove for a second and talk about a key national issue where there's been movement in the Trump administration. And when I try to put the Trump revolution in an energy and environmental context. I think a lot about the signing ceremony that the president had for his energy and climate legislation just about 3 weeks ago. And the symbolism of that was huge, as Trump is very, very good at, President understands political theater really, really well. You know, he's sitting there with his golden pen, and he had the burly coal miners behind him, and he was flanked by his loyal cabinet secretaries. And, you know, it's a piece of political theater, just speaking from that. I mean, it was very, very effective. But I think the reality of the order itself, if you read it, was a little more prosaic, a little more kind of, you know, there weren't kind of fireworks exploding. There are going to be some things in that order that are going to make an immediate difference, but it's going to take a long while for us to see really fundamental changes here. Government, even with as dramatic departure from the kind of standard candidate as Trump or the standard president as Trump, is not like Henry Hub gas prices. It's not 1 year you're at $2 and then the next year you're at $12. If you think of gas prices as maybe a metaphor for how government operates, I'd say government regulation is usually sitting there at a $5 price, let's say. And if you can move that to $4 or $6 with policy, you're a political revolutionary. And the legal system and the permanent bureaucracy that are out there ensure a greater degree of stability in our policy environment, for better or for worse. I mean, I think sometimes, you know, for worse, I think we've lost a little bit democratically, but that's a side note. So I want to drill down a little bit more into this, if you'll pardon that turn of phrase, into President Trump's order and talk about the substance of what it didn't do, because I think that's as important as what it did for kind of understanding implications for Colorado. And then I'll talk also a little bit, obviously, about what it did do. So let's talk about first the couple things that it didn't do that were really notable. First, it did not withdraw America from the Paris Accord on climate change. And the second, I think, really notable thing it didn't do was it didn't contest the EPA's endangerment finding on greenhouse gases. So I'll talk about what those, I'd say those were actually arguably the two most important things, is kind of the dog that didn't bark. I'll talk more in the detail about what that means, but let me first then talk about what it did do, because it did do a lot of important things. It called to revisit the so-called social cost of carbon. And again, you know, I hope those eyes don't glaze over here, but this stuff ends up being very important for how regulations are designed in Colorado and elsewhere. And social cost of carbon is this metric that's been used throughout the government, and they went through this long kind of process of calculating essentially what the social cost of carbon emissions should be. And that is used for all sorts of environmental rulemaking under the National Environmental Policy Act and other things. So it's very important. It didn't eliminate it. Some people called for it to be eliminated on the right. And I don't know what formulas that the Trump administration is going to use as they kick off this process of reevaluating that. But if I were a betting man, I would bet quite a bit of money that the Trump EPA is going to come up with a much lower cost of carbon emissions, and the implications of that for coal and oil and gas and what projects can be justified ultimately is really high as a matter of environmental rulemaking. Now I will, again, I'm going to veer into personal opinion, for which I apologize, but this, to me, unfortunately, social cost of carbon is going to be with us, but I think it's pseudoscience at its worst. And I would argue that is true irrespective of whether you think climate change is a very grave threat or a non-existent one. If you understand how these calculations are done, which I would not wish on anybody, but some people have done it, it all kind of ends up, depending on what's called discount rates that you use, and a bunch of, frankly, fairly arbitrary assumptions. And it's what in academia we would call scientism instead of science. So it's something that sort of gives the appearance of doing science, but it's not really science. And I think we just need to be, it's just politically motivated guesswork, ultimately. This is my personal view. You know, it's a bunch of fancy models chasing after reality, but not even getting close to catching it. And I think it would be far better for us to just say, there's a certain level of risk that's out there with respect to climate, with emissions, and just to talk frankly about like what we think we're willing to accept and what we aren't, which is ultimately a question of priorities and values, and is something that I think should be democratically decided in Congress and not by agencies. But it's ultimately an ethical and a risk management debate that is hiding under this patina of science, which is not really science. So that's sort of a separate thing. I'm going to beat on the administration to whatever extent I can. I think that they do probably have that viewpoint privately, but the problems, their legal problems with just eliminating this, is something that is having an effect on policy. From that same executive order, the administration all but declared the Clean Power Plan, which had sort of been the centerpiece of the Obama administration's implemented energy policy, is going to be repealed. Now, it didn't actually say this, but that's functionally what's going to happen. The Clean Power Plan is dead on arrival, okay, whether it's formally or informally. Having said that, I'm not really sure that it makes all that much difference at this point. The move from coal to gas, which was really one of the most important effects of the Clean Power Plan as it was being developed, because utilities could sort of see the writing on the wall in which direction this train was heading, has already happened. Certainly it's already underway. In 2016, natural gas passed coal for the first time to be the #1 fuel for power generation for an entire year. We had 34% of our power from natural gas last year nationwide, only 30% from coal. Coal was 50% maybe 8-9 years ago. So I mean, it's really been a pretty dramatic reversal that has a number of environmental benefits in addition to having economic benefits. Now, some of that was the result of the Obama administration's very unfriendly regulatory stance toward coal, but a lot of that was just the voice of Mr. Market being heard. They were out producing stuff, and there's a lot of low-cost gas out there, and given the various hurdles that coal plants had to get through, all of a sudden natural gas began to look much more appealing. The repeal of the Clean Power Plan is going to open up possibilities for new conventional coal plants, however, that could compete with gas, and that could affect demand in places like here. And so that's why you can't even just say in a simple and naive way, well, you know, Trump's in and therefore it's going to be good for development here, because there's so many factors at play. Under Obama, functionally, the way that they had designed the rules, the only new coal plants that could be built functionally were those that were essentially capturing a significant amount of carbon. That technology, it does exist, but it is essentially commercially unproven at this point. I mean, you can use it in weird ways with enhanced oil recovery, and you can do other things, but as a general rule, like the Obama administration had essentially mandated that we use a non-commercial technology. Again, I'm not trying to make a judgment on that. I'm just saying that's what it was. So that functionally killed all coal power plant development. I think Trump will absolutely challenge that, this administration, and I think that unlike some of the things that they didn't challenge because they think they'll lose on it, I think that they'll probably win on that in court, because I think, again, without getting into sort of the boring legalese, I think that is that regulation is going to have a tough time standing. And I think it is frankly excessive personally. But so just because a Trump proposal benefits fossil fuels doesn't necessarily mean it's going to benefit folks who are trying to develop natural gas or oil. Trump, in this executive order, revisited rules on fugitive methane leakage. Obviously, this is relevant to folks here. I would expect some sort of rulemaking. The Obama administration, as again, many folks here I'm sure know, had put in some pretty tough self-reporting requirements the industry was not thrilled with that, although they were sort of grumbling and going along. I would expect to see some revised rulemaking that would acknowledge that, frankly, companies are already highly financially incentivized to stop major sources of methane leakage because that's money that they're not burning, if you'll pardon the expression. And so they would like to gather that. That doesn't mean that I think we'll reset to zero, but I think we will reset to something that is not as kind of tight as what Obama had. So I think, I talked about the general other thing that was also part of this executive order saying, Trump has sort of put out an APB saying, agencies report back to me about anything that is keeping us from producing domestic energy. I think what this whole process has shown is that Trump, too, can wield a pen and a phone, just like Obama famously did. So now I want to get into a little bit more. I touched on what they didn't do, because I think that is also important. It didn't touch what is called this endangerment finding. And again, that was a rule that says essentially that carbon emissions are dangerous to human health and the environment. This was something that, again, went through an entire process of scientific review. And I think Administrator Pruett of the EPA whatever his personal views, because he took a lot of flack from not challenging this ruling from the right, decided it wasn't worth challenging in court, at least at this time. And I think it was functionally a practical move on his part rather than an ideological one. He doesn't think that factually he's likely to win that case on the merits given the factual findings that are out there. And again, I'm not making a value judgment about whether that's good or bad. I think that's just where it sits. If ultimately the administration really decides that they want to get rid of the endangerment finding, I think really the best way to do that, though it's going to be a huge fight politically, would be to explicitly revise the Clean Air Act to strip out CO2 from the purview of the Clean Air Act. Needless to say, that would be a huge political fight, but I do think that it would have the advantage, again, from a democratic perspective of it, as opposed to these things that happen in these esoteric rulemaking bodies where, people in this room know it and I know it, but Joe Voter doesn't understand it at all. It puts that thing right out and says, let's have a debate on it. Let's let the public decide what level and what type of regulation they want to see on CO2. You're not asking them to get into the details, but just what's our position? And I think that for that reason, again, as a personal view, I think that sort of more democratic process would, rather than a backroom deal, would actually be the right way to go. Whether they're going to even try to do that, I don't know. I think there's probably some of the more aggressive people who'd like to, but you're going to have filibusters and all sorts of other things you'll have to deal with. I think the endangerment finding and how this administration treats this endangerment finding is sort of the canary in the coal mine, if you'll pardon a coal reference at this oil and gas conference, for understanding how they're going to deal with a lot of energy and environmental regulations. Because ultimately, if you don't get rid of the endangerment finding, you eventually kind of have to come up with your own version of a clean power plan. It doesn't need to be exactly like that. You can certainly do something that's going to be a lot friendlier to fossil fuels, and you kind of go through this multi-year process. But I think a lot of conservatives who are concerned about not going after the endangerment finding simply think that without it, you're sort of stuck with Obama's energy policy or some version of it. So that's, again, I'm not trying to make a judgment about what's good or bad. I'm just trying to make you understand a little bit about what the ground that this is being fought on. I think this administration has shown that, at least with respect to these issues, they are not ideological Don Quixotes that are sort of tilting at windmills. I think that would be emotionally satisfying for a lot of conservatives and maybe for some in the industry. But my friends, I don't know Administrator Pruett at all, but I have friends who've worked quite closely with him, and they tell me he's the former Oklahoma Attorney General. He's very careful and methodical about how he builds cases, and he's not going to take on a cause that he thinks is a loser just for a short-term political bump. And so if he does eventually take on the endangerment finding directly, it's because he will be convinced that there is a path to legal victory. And I think a similar rationale explains the decision, at least for now, to remain in the Paris Climate Accord, something that supposedly was explicitly lobbied for by Secretary of State Tillerson and his old colleague company ExxonMobil. And at first blush, this would seem an odd decision from a group that was really excoriated by environmentalists, but in another way, it makes sense. Exxon, like many oil and gas companies, has softened its stance on climate change in recent years, and they would rather work with a predictable, if slightly less favorable system that they know and understand than kind of do random risk hedging in an environment that they don't understand. And I think that while there's little love for the Paris International Climate Accords within the administration, I suspect that they also wonder whether the juice is really worth the squeeze of withdrawing. The Paris Accord is entirely aspirational. It has no enforcement mechanisms whatsoever. Many countries badly missed their targets under the Kyoto Protocol, and there was seemingly no public price to pay for that. The administration is dealing with delicate problems right now, as we may have noticed, from Iran to North Korea, and I think it's made a decision at this time, at least with respect to this order, that regardless of the personal feelings about the Paris Accord of various administration personnel, and I think they're honestly mixed, this is not the particular hill they want to die on right now. So those are two issues, the endangerment finding and the Paris Accord, I think, to kind of watch, because I think they will be sort of indicators of where this administration is going. New Secretary of Interior Ryan Zinke, I want to move to personnel and talk a little bit about that, so I think we can understand who the big players are. He's sort of a Teddy Roosevelt conservationist Republican, he even mentions this on his Twitter feed. He's certainly not an environmentalist, but if there was one kind of Trump nominee in this space that got a relatively free pass from the environmentalists on his nomination, it was Zinke. And I actually think, as I sort of alluded to before, that in the long run, that's actually quite protective for energy development. When we get too greedy, when we kind of ignore safeguards, I think that's where we run into problems. Disasters like the Deepwater Horizon spill were not only terrible for the environment, which they absolutely were, it was a tragedy, it's equally bad for business. And I'm sure a lot of folks saw that. And I think Secretary Zinke understands that at a fundamental level, and I think that's going to guide how he thinks about how we deal with these things at Interior. The most sustainable energy development policy for business and the environment is one that pays attention to both. Secretary Zinke has actually explicitly pushed to bring the National Forest system underneath the Department of the Interior, where it really does belong, rather than the Department of Agriculture, where it has resided. I don't think he's going to get anywhere with that in the near future, but I think it's interesting that he's sort of flagging that. Right now, Forestry Department, which again, a lot of oil and gas lands, is the only significant land agency that is not under the Interior. But I think it would make a lot of sense to put these forests in a place where we've got a lot of expertise in conservation and resource development, rather than, say, corn and wheat expertise, which is where it exists right now. And another thing about, I think, the new secretary is that, like Trump, he's not a political person by background. He did serve one term in the Montana legislature. He did spend one term in Congress, but he spent 20 plus years as a Navy SEAL. And I think we've already seen that kind of SEAL background from him. He has a certain can-do attitude. This is a guy who rode a horse into his job the first day. Okay, I was sort of making a statement. He's not just going to sit at his desk. I think he wants to put more personnel out in the field. He said that quite explicitly, less in Washington. And I don't think he's going to have a lot of patience for bureaucracy stifling his agenda. So it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out. Interestingly and somewhat controversially on some parts of the right, he has explicitly said that he is not interested in selling off or otherwise disposing federal lands, which has been something of a rallying cry of many out west, given that half of lands in the West, and I think about 36% in this state, are owned by the federal government. So we're going to see maybe federal lands be differently managed, but we're not going to see federal lands not become federal lands under Secretary Zinke. And I think he's going to be really genuinely considering environment and not just kind of checking the minimum set of boxes that he feels like he can get away with checking to go do resource development. Having said that, in the short term, he's already lifted a moratorium on federal lands for coal leasing. He's canceled some Obama administration things. And given that about 40% of our coal comes from BLM lands, that's an important decision. He's also waded into the social cost of carbon debates, which I alluded to earlier. And he's called for transparency in its calculation, but he said the social cost of not having a job is important too. I think that's a pretty clever turn of phrase that also shows a good bit of apt description of political reality. I think he's going to make sure that jobs and environment are balanced. And I think, he kind of, a great summary of his overall thinking is, he said, I read a quote from him recently, "My intention is to be the steward over the majesty of our public lands," he told the Fox News late last month, "and to make sure that we can make wealth and jobs on some of it." And that's it. I mean, I think that's kind of who this guy is. I'm enthusiastic about him. I think he's going to be really good in that role, so I'm excited to see what he'll do. We'll move to Secretary Perry at the Department of Energy. Again, DOE has a little bit less to do with the oil and gas world, although certainly is involved. Again, I know a number of folks who've worked closely with Secretary Perry, and they've praised his skills as a people manager. He's also obviously an excellent retail politician. You don't get elected 3 terms as governor of Texas without understanding retail politics. He's comfortable in delegating a lot to subordinates, but then holding them accountable. And he likes the spotlight, but I think one interesting thing is he's an oil and gas guy, right? He's a Texan, okay? And yet he's running this portfolio in DOE in which half of it is nuclear and a huge bit of that is weapons and proliferation. So there's going to be a learning curve here for him. And I could see him doing something very innovative in the department that we're not expecting. I mean, it's just sort of one of these unknown unknowns. But this is not a guy who's just going to sit there and be an apparatchik or a functionary. It's just not in his DNA. And so you may see maybe aggressive support for fossil fuel R&D. I don't know exactly what it'll be, but not a guy who's just going to sit on the sideline. So DOE may be a place where we see movement, and he may exercise more influence over oil and gas policy than we typically see for a Secretary of Energy. Now I'm going to turn to EPA and talk about Scott Pruett, who I think has been really miscast by the media. I don't know, again, the administrator personally, but I know several folks who've worked closely with him. And I don't think he's the sort of anti-EPA cowboy that he's been portrayed in a lot of the media as. I think he's concerned about overreach, but he's also concerned about environmental protection. And when he was Oklahoma's AG, he pursued certain cases against the EPA that, given where he was sitting institutionally as the Attorney General of Oklahoma, made a lot of sense. And I think in the role of EPA administrator, he has a different set of priorities. And I think he's been really clear that he doesn't feel that EPA has the sufficient direction right now from Congress to tackle climate issues. But I think he does want to act aggressively on cleaning up air and water, in taking areas that have been out of air quality and water quality attainment for decades, and people are just sort of, we keep doing these stricter and stricter standards without paying any attention to whether the old standards are even being attained. I think he's going to really, what we're going to see out of a Pruett EPA is very concrete steps where either him or the president is going to be able to go to X place and say, we accomplished this goal, and there's going to be a nice signing ceremony and things like that. I think this is going to be a very tangible and not abstract kind of EPA commissioner. So it's obviously going to be more limited in scope. It's going to be more interested in working with industry, but I don't think it's going to forget its fundamental mission of environmental protection. So we talked about personnel, but in many ways, I think the bigger issue is the personnel that are not there right now. And what do I mean by that? We talked earlier about Jordan Cove. I think Trump's FERC is absolutely going to revisit Jordan Cove, but the fact that it hasn't already points to a big problem within the senior administration, which is the slowness of senior appointments. Right now, FERC is literally, which we need approval from FERC to do any of this, any pipelines, anything like that, is non-operational with respect to major decisions because it lacks a commissioner quorum. Okay, we have 2 commissioners. We're about to lose another one in June out of 5. The names of several highly qualified candidates have been leaked to the press for months now, but nothing has been announced. And this is an administration issue, okay, not a Senate one, as best I can tell. I mean, one of the names mentioned most frequently, pretty much on all the lists, is my friend Neil Chatterjee, who was Mitch McConnell's energy point person for the last several years. Believe me, Senator McConnell has not forgotten about him, and so I can only assume that somebody else has forgotten about him. The other 2 rumored picks that you pretty much see in all of these are Robert Powelson, who is the president of NARUC, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, and a very thoughtful guy, and Kevin McIntyre, who I don't know personally, but is at Jones Day. He's the head of their energy practice, a big firm in DC. These are all credible, experienced energy policy hands. They're eminently qualified to be at FERC, but they can't make rulings if they're not even nominated, okay? So I'll quote from Power Magazine, Power Industry Trade Journal, writing earlier this week. Said, while highlighting the stuff of Washington Post's A-section attention, the inability of Trump to unlock FERC, which currently has no quorum, holds up most important U.S. infrastructure projects, including natural gas pipelines, LNG export terminals. This costs the U.S. jobs. Why we're not moving more aggressively here is a mystery to me. I cannot tell you why. All these guys seem very competent, and there's no movement. It's very frustrating for those of us who would like to see responsible energy development, but we can't have a policy unless we get personnel. So I think one thing that people in this room could aggressively communicate to their representatives and to Washington is the importance of getting a FERC quorum sooner rather than later. And again, it's a little bit of a mystery to me as to why we haven't moved faster on that. I'd like to go a little bit bigger and broader right now. I've been in the weeds a little bit talking about what's going to happen to various programs and personnel. And now I'd like to discuss the broad philosophy of the Trump Energy and Environment Program. And the one thing I can project with 100% certainty is that President Trump is going to be unpredictable. Anybody who says they know for sure what this administration is going to do is not somebody I'd trust. So take everything I just said and add a big qualifier on it, okay? This is educated, I'd like to think very educated, but ultimately educated guesswork on my part, right? I'm a firm believer that personnel is policy, and that's why I spent a lot of time talking about my views on kind of who the top folks are, just to give folks a sense who may not know. I think even at the sub-cabinet choices, again, huge numbers of vacancies, but we have had experienced hands on deck. The folks I know who've gone in are the sort of people who I'd like to see going in. I think they're thoughtful people. I don't think they're bomb throwers. If you're Republican, you're probably going to like them. If you're Democrat, you probably won't like them. But they're not kind of people so far off the reservation that they're going to be, doing stuff that people are going to find crazy. And they do have deep backgrounds in the subject. So I think it's notable that Trump put in these elected officials rather than bureaucrats to handle these departments. And I think that's largely a good thing. I think that having people who understand how to face the public and the concerns of the public can be a real asset when you're talking about moving contentious energy projects and balancing energy and environment and recreation and all the other things that we need to appropriately balance when we talk about what we're going to do. We don't have small government fundamentalists here. And again, it's not I've been accused of being a small government fundamentalist at times myself, but I think the reality is these people certainly want to decrease the reach of certain institutions, but nobody here is going to declare victory by having gigantic cuts to their own department. And I think that's another kind of interesting wrinkle, and it was alluded to, these sorts of cuts, very steep for the EPA, pretty steep for energy, less steep for interior, but still significant, that have been proposed by this administration. I think one of the challenges right now is, the reality is I expect most of those cuts are DOA. When they actually come to going through Congress, they will not actually happen. I'm not saying that the administration doesn't want them to happen. I'm just saying Congress, I don't think, will let it happen. And so that creates this interesting sort of set of incentives in that the administration can't currently hire for positions that it's saying it wants to cut, and yet those positions are probably going to be there once we finally go through a budgeting process. So that's kind of a downside of having taken such an aggressive position on cutting some of these departments. I mean, there are upsides to it too, particularly if you're a small government type. But I think when the rubber hits the road right now, we're probably not filling some positions that are in fact going to be there because we're trying to create an illusion that these positions are going to go away. Now I want to really go up and just talk pure politics for a second. Elections are really going to matter. And at one level, that seems obvious. But at another level, I think it's a part of the story that people are missing, and particularly people who are just energy experts and who don't have the misfortune of dabbling in politics as I do. The GOP has unified control of the government currently, and I think a lot of folks know that. And if Justice Kennedy retires at the end of this year, as I think most people expect he will, although it's not certain, and is replaced by a conservative, we may have a conservative, durable majority on the court for a while. But presidents' parties tend to fare poorly in off-year elections, particularly in the first term. So we need to see what kind of the post-2018 environment is likely to look like electorally, because I think that tells us a lot about what sort of policy making we might see post-2018. We just had two notable special elections in the Kansas 4th District and Georgia 6th District. So, why am I going to talk about those at an energy conference? Because it's ultimately relevant. Politicians are always looking over their shoulders, looking, hey, which way is the wind blowing? And that affects what issues they bring before the public and how they vote on issues that come before them. So the media has sort of been relentlessly pushing a narrative of Republican disarray with respect to these elections, only to be disappointed by the results of the elections, which were not really so apocalyptic for the Republicans. They won both of them. They run them by lower margins than Republicans would have liked to have run them in fairly Republican districts, but it was not sort of an apocalypse scenario. It was a we're going to lose some seats scenario, and we'd like to be in a better position. In the Georgia 6th District, which just happened earlier this week, Democrats spent $8 million. They brought in Hollywood celebrities. There were, I think, 9 Republicans running. There was 1 serious Democrat running. And the Democrat ran only 1% over what Hillary Clinton did and failed to avoid a runoff versus some badly outspent Republican challengers. And so a real political earthquake, if really there was a Trumpocalypse happening to the GOP right now, you would have seen an outright Democratic victory in Georgia 06 this week, and you didn't see that. And so what that suggests to me is the surf is up for the Democrats at the moment. I'm not trying to deny reality. I'm not trying to be the Baghdad Bob of the 2018 election cycle. For those of you who remember Saddam Hussein's spokesman who declared how wonderfully the army was doing in Iraq, even as the U.S. was overrunning their positions. But they're just not signs of a tidal wave right now. They're signs that the Democrats are set for a good 2018. If you held an election now, there's 19 months or whatever till that happens, and a lot of things can go. And I think that's important, setting that up, because there are a lot of things that can happen, barring a really catastrophic meltdown. And apologies in advance. I just want to geek out some numbers here. But basically, if you look at roll call and the Cook Political Report, basically what you would see is for the Republicans to lose the House, they would have to lose pretty much all of the seats that are rated as toss-ups, all of the seats that are rated as leaning Republicans, and half or more of the seats that are rated as going likely Republican, and they'd have to get almost no Democratic seats. Could that happen? In wave elections, that sort of thing absolutely does happen. But right now, we're not yet seeing a wave election. In the Senate, I think it's even more slanted toward the GOP. Just 9 of the 34 seats up in 2018 are GOP-held seats. And in each of those seats, the GOP is favored to win by every single major race handicapper. The GOP is rated as absolutely safe, meaning, in other words, it would be a stunning upset for them to lose in 6 of those 9 seats. In 7 of those 9 seats, Texas being the only other one at play, they are rated as safe by 2 of the 3 handicappers and likely by the other. If the GOP loses Texas Senate, they've got big problems. The reason why I mentioned that 7 is all they need to do is win 7 seats and they will hold control of the Senate, okay? There are 10 seats coming up in Congress in the Senate that were won in states run by Donald Trump that currently have a Democratic senator. So there's lots of opportunities for the Republicans to build in the Senate. And so where you kind of come down when you look at all this is, frankly, if the Republicans lose the Senate, and probably even the House, you're going to need, it's going to be a lot more than sage grouse that we're going to be worrying about. It's going to be like the passenger pigeon. The GOP will have gone extinct. You know, it is a very favorable electoral map for the GOP. And the GOP is going to be facing some headwinds, but they are still going to have that very favorable map looking at them. And the reason why I'm telling all of you guys this in an energy conference, you haven't walked into the wrong conference. It's because it really matters from a perspective of Trump, if he doesn't, you know, really alienate voters, is likely going to have a minimum of 4 years to work with a pretty unified government supporting him. That's what's most likely to happen. That is not universally true for even, you know, even Obama ran into this problem. Moving back into the energy realm, you know, stuff is slow. I talked to a senior appointee in one of Trump's energy-related departments this week, and he said of the 7 key kind of political appointments in his office, only 2 had been made. None of them had been approved by Congress. One of them was probably going to leave for another department. That's not out of the norm right now. And again, I don't think it's folks that are being lazy, you know, far from it. It's just, we've got a lot of folks here, you know, they're outsiders. They've come to quote unquote drain the swamp, but you know, the swamp has a lot of useful little critters in it too. And I think between being very averse to having never Trump types in there and the lobbying ban and folks like my friend Mike McKenna, who used to be running energy transition but had to step aside because he wasn't willing to give up the potential to be a lobbyist for 5 years, which has been quite lucrative for him, you end up eliminating a lot of good candidates, and that's just the reality. Again, it's not a criticism, it's just an observation. So a lot of his regulatory stuff will depend on whether he gets 4 years or 8. He's gonna, I think, very likely have 4 solid years of friendly Congress to work with, but whether he gets more than that, it remains to be seen. He still has the bureaucracy to contend with, and that's, I think, the real problem with him not making these political appointments. The bureaucracy is, I think, hostile to Trump. 94% of DC voted against Trump. 70+% of the DC suburbs voted against Trump. I think bureaucrats are pretty reliably generally liberal. They are not going to be eager to do Donald Trump's work for him if he doesn't do it himself. So, you know, how does that affect things? How am I doing on time, by the way? Do I need to zoom through? Okay, I'll try to wrap up fairly quickly here because I know that we've got a lot to do, and I do want to leave a little time for questions. On climate change, those domestic pressures are not going to go away. I was meeting with Canada's Ministry of Environment and Climate Change just yesterday. They're going to continue to push on this issue, so Trump is going to need to figure out how he wants to deal with that. There's been some indication that there might even be a carbon tax as part of a broader tax reform effort that would be strenuously opposed by some conservatives, and it might be okay with other conservatives if regulatory reform came with it. Nuclear, I have a new book coming out on in a month. That's another thing. It's not natural gas, but it has a substitution effect with natural gas. If we're developing nuclear, we need less gas. There is, I can tell you, having talked to folks at DOE, significant interest in kind of stopping the hemorrhaging of nuclear power. So if that happens, that's going to affect things here. In coal, similar thing. Obama, relentlessly hostile to coal. I don't think that's news or a controversial view. Trump, has made coal part of his public messaging. The death of coal is not going to happen on Donald Trump's watch. It's just not. I think that realistic energy folks know that perhaps there's not going to be a coal renaissance given what's going on in natural gas, but it's not going to just suddenly crater. So that's something to watch. On natural gas, I don't think we're going to have federal regulation, but we might get some preemption of fracking bans. I mean, who knows? Conservatives for a long time have been saying state regulation of fracking is the right way to go. I think that's actually right, but I think there may be some move from Washington to kind of rein in states from being too aggressive about being no. And given, frankly, that the science on fracking is very positive toward doing it, I think that's great. Sage grouse. Secretary Zinke has called for state-driven solutions. There was a level of bipartisan compromise in the old solution that was just done, but the game has changed. Trump simply can't ignore the blueprints that amended 98 BLM and Forest Service land regulations, covered 70 million acres. You know, you need to go through a whole public comment again. I mean, there's a whole process. But I would expect that you're still going to see some revision that's going to be more friendly toward development. Both Rob Bishop in the House and Jim Risch in the Senate have sort of put forth bills already on sage grouse, attempting to sort of loosen things up. But this is all going to be paid a lot of attention to. Believe me, the enviros are going to go out. They are going to sue on this issue. They are going to be happy to sue on this issue. And the judicial system is going to come in and have its say. The Endangered Species Act listing for sage grouse is still a specter on the horizon, and you're going to see the environmentalists perhaps argue for other species listing, which is one of the reasons you need fundamental Endangered Species Act reform, because it's just completely out of whack from good environmental management the way it's done right now. You know, there may be some more friendly settlements with Trump DOJ, but there's still sage grouse is out there. But things are highly cyclical. I think it's important to note when we also talk about new political actors on the stage, Neil Gorsuch's mother was Ronald Reagan's EPA administrator. A lot of people don't know that. And she clashed a lot with congressional Democrats and environmental groups. I'm not saying that Justice Gorsuch has the same views, but you can bet that he's pretty informed on these issues. And so I think at least to the extent that this sort of stuff comes before the court, you're going to see some very informed opinion writing on this. So I know that we are running short, if not out of time. What I've tried to do is sketch out a broad outline of where I think energy policy is going in the Trump administration, who the players are, what the issues is, who's up and down. But my overall message is that it's going to be predictably unpredictable. And the great Nobel Prize winning physicist Niels Bohr once observed that prediction is always difficult, especially about the future. And I think that is particularly apt when we're talking about climate and energy policies over the next 4 years of the Trump administration. I think it's going to keep all of us who care about both energy and politics and the politics of energy on the edge of our seats. And I'm looking forward to being part of the ride. So thank you very much for your time.
Questions?
Questions? Anybody?
Oh, do I have something?
Right. With the BLM director, or when it might happen?
Gosh, you know, I'm just going to have to punt on that. I would expect that it's going to be kind of someone in line with Zinke's general viewpoint, but I have not heard any specific names get floated for that position yet. I have a little bit less intel onto like who the interior policy will be. It'll probably be a lot of Montana folks, just because that's where Zinke's from. And you know, again, that's good. I mean, we've got Westerners in charge here. I was talking about this with the commissioner earlier, and so they understand some of the resource issues out in the West. And obviously, BLM is hugely important for energy development.
Yeah, Jeremy, Steve Soychek from Colorado Mesa University.
Yeah.
We have some students here. So your state, California,
Yeah.
And Stanford University in particular too, are big on renewables.
Yep.
Your state has the highest I think, cost per kilowatt hour in the western states, about 18 cents versus Colorado. I think we're at 12 cents. The national average might be 12 cents a kilowatt hour. You also have the highest percentage of renewables.
Yeah.
So can you talk about that a little bit? Yeah.
Yeah, well, they're directly correlated, right? I mean, if anything I said looks like I endorsed California's energy policy, please let me disabuse you of that notion. I mean, having said that, yes, it is directly the high price environment. And oh, by the way, we've shut down our nuclear plants. And so we're not even reducing carbon emissions over the last decade as fast as other states have been. So it's totally just political theater that has nothing to do with any tangible environmental goal, that has nothing to do with good management or good science. It's just relying on a bunch of voters to like shout the latest slogan. I mean, that's just, I'm sorry, that's the cold hard reality of it. Okay, I mean, the numbers do not lie. I've written a lot on California energy policy. And in fact, one of my big critics who wrote these papers with me is a former Democratic Public Utilities Commissioner in California. So this is not just a partisan critique. That having been said, I am not a renewables basher. You know, I think it's great that, I mean, we've seen a real reduction in cost of renewables. We've seen real increase in applicability of renewables. I think renewables, absolutely, both wind and solar, have a piece of the energy puzzle. I think as storage gets better, particularly grid scale storage, that may increase over time, and I think that's great. But the problem is California's policy has been pretending like we're there already, and we're not there already, and Californians are paying with that through their pocketbooks. So, other questions?
I had one.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that the BLM ignored the Mancos Shale and all 4 of the RMPs in the forest plan, which they did, and many in this room pointed out. What leads you to believe that this is on the administration's radar, as you mentioned earlier?
Well, so I mean, the one thing, and again, it's just like, it was really naive, but this guy at Heritage really does, he has been like a pipeline into the administration, Nick Loris, and he's written, I mean, he has a paper that he's written about the Mancos Shale. And so that leads me to believe that Nick is going to make sure that folks there are paying attention. And it's like, I mean, this is not the hard stuff, right? Like, this is like the $20 bill that's just lying on the ground waiting for people to pick up, right? Like, you have an entire management plan that's been done based on a resource thing that's totally out of date, and nobody disputes that it's out of date. So I think that you will see action on Mancos. I think the bigger thing that will drive Mancos is, I know that my understanding is production has always been more expensive in Mancos than some other shales. So I think that may be a gating factor at some point. But I think certainly, I think the administration will try to show that they are very open to a more generous interpretation of resource extraction than what the previous administration did in that shale. Other questions? Anyone? Is there a question there in the back, or just somebody holding a microphone? Yeah.
Yes, sir. Ray Beck, Moffat County Commissioner. You know, you touched on a lot of topics that are very sensitive here to Western Colorado and all of Colorado, actually. But what about the Equal Access to Justice Act and the effects that has on rules and regulations that impact our quality way of life? Can we address that, or is the Trump administration going to address it?
You know, I'm going to have to plead ignorance here. Can you expand on that? It's just not something that I've been. I mean, is that like? I assume you're talking about a specific thing that's just a random phrase.
Well, in terms of lawsuits and how they
okay.
how that's affected us, because we don't have access to just a pocket of money there. We can go sue people.
No. And this is true, right? I mean, this is, again, it seemed I had a long talk, but there's so much that you want to cover that you can't. It's a real problem, right? And this is a broader democratic problem, small d democratic, not partisan statement, in that our society has become so litigious that it's simply becoming almost post-democratic. We simply can't do anything about anything without lawsuits kind of coming in to gum up the works. There's no clarity. Even when the regulations are clear, we simply can't move forward, and it almost doesn't even matter who we elected to president. I think this is a profound problem for our democracy as a whole. It's not just an energy problem. I am very sympathetic for folks here who don't necessarily maybe have deep pockets in the way that some of their opponents do. You know, I would love to see this administration go put the fear of God into the overreach of courts. Okay, I think that is a hill to die on, and it's not even because I'm trying to get to a certain partisan place. I don't think, regardless of which way the courts were ruling, that we're not here to be ruled by judges. Okay, I mean, the Supreme Court has its place. Other judges absolutely have their place. I'm not suggesting that we get rid of them by any stretch, but we've gotten to the point where we simply can't do anything. Okay, because of the way that our justice system is functioning. And that is not the way the system was designed by our framers. So there are specific things I could give you, but it's kind of outside the purview of this talk. Any other thoughts, questions? Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you.